The views expressed in this course are those of the professor and do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the Teaching Company, LLC, the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Great works on strategy often appear amidst radical changes in the scale, breadth, and lethality of war. Transformative conflicts like that also spark tectonic shifts in the political landscape. As such, you see fundamental changes in statecraft. That's the ways states are organized and governed. Those things will release both the creative and destructive potential of societies. For China, the Eastern Zhou was one of these revolutionary epochs, an age comprised of the Spring and Autumn period, running from about 770 to about 475 BCE, and the Warring States period, from 475 to about 221. The Eastern Zhou covers the same span of time as the founding of the Roman Republic to the end of the Punic Wars. For Greece, that era includes the Persian Wars, the rise and fall of the Athenian Empire, as well as Alexander the Great. It was also the age of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, and the Great Library of Alexandria, things that laid the foundations of Western civilization. The Eastern Zhou does the same for Chinese civilization. It was an era of nearly constant war, but also an age when 100 flowers bloomed and 100 schools of thought contended. Schools of thought that produced seminal texts on philosophy, ethics, aesthetics, and religion, as well as on warfare and statecraft. Books often attributed to the historic figures who drove or figured in those transformations. Such classics are often found texts, where later authors attribute their own theories to an earlier figure or create an earlier figure who's living through tumultuous times. But as we saw last time, just because a particular master didn't actually write the text doesn't mean that you can ignore their backstory. That backstory gives the book context and meaning. The original audience would have already been familiar with the outcome of those tumultuous events. But books like the Sun Tzu explain those outcomes in new ways. When it comes to China's military classics, the outcome of events depend on the extent to which the lead characters in the dramas adhere to or ignore the master's strategic and tactical advice. In Master Sun's case, the drama was the kingdom of Wu's epic rise and fall. Wu was situated at the Yangtze River's eastern end, with its capital at the modern city of Suzhou. Over 3 generations at the turn of the 5th century BCE, Wu went from a second-tier power to political, military supremacy, and then to complete extermination. And since General Sun was said to be one of Wu's commanders, Wu's glory days are therefore attributable to King Helu, the king of Wu, following Sun Wu's advice. But after Sun Wu leaves the stage, Helu's descendants ignore those lessons, and the dynasty comes to a nasty end. In addition to the story of Wu's rise and fall, it's equally important to get the backstory on Qi. That's Master Sun's native land, and the first military and intellectual powerhouse of the Spring and Autumn period. We're also going to be looking at what happened in the centuries after Wu's demise, decades that brought an end to all but one of China's warring states, and saw the birth of a unified empire. That last warring state was Qin, so think of today's lecture as a drama in 3 acts. Act 1, we open with Qi, then Act 2, we move on to Wu, and Act 3 closes with Qin. Act 1. Sun Wu's homeland, the northern state of Qi, shared modern Shandong province with Confucius's home state, Lu. And like Lu, Qi could trace its history back to the 11th century BCE and the founding of the Zhou dynasty. The first Duke of Qi, the semi-legendary Zhang Ziya, served as advisor and military commander to Wen and Wu, the first two kings of the Zhou. The classic attributed to Zhang Ziya, the 6 secret teachings of the Grand Duke, reads like a script the Zhou kings followed in their rise to power. First under King Wen, where he undermined the despotic Shang dynasty politically. And then under King Wu, who crushed the Shang militarily. Lu's Confucians, however, preferred to attribute Zhou's victories to their leader's moral superiority. Not surprising. Lu's founder was the son of King Wu's brother and Confucius's idol, the Duke of Zhou. China's strategic classics, however, like the Sun Tzu and the 6 secret teachings, credit Zhou's rise more to espionage, deception, and violence. For his service, which included leading the chariot assault that broke the Shang army at the Battle of Muya in 1046 BCE, Zhang Ziya was granted a duchy along the new Zhou kingdom's northeast frontier. That was a mixed blessing. 11th century Qi sat on the ragged edge of Huaxia civilization. Huaxia is shorthand for Chinese civilization. The region's indigenous tribes posed a chronic threat and forced Qi to maintain high military readiness. You get an idea of Qi's martial ethos from the horse tombs near its ancient capital, Linzi. And if you look at a map of that city's archaeological remains, you can clearly see the walls, water features, and weapons foundries that comprise the Chinese character for state, guo. But while the Zhou dynasty lasted nearly 800 years, it never actually ruled all of China. Internally, it was structured as a feudal confederation, consisting initially in the 11th century of hundreds of city-states and larger polities, all pledging their loyalty to the Zhou and making their personal armies available to its kings. Moreover, not all of China was ruled by Zhou loyalists. The Zhou's allies were in fact islands of Huaxia culture, urbanization, and sedentary agriculture in a sea of indigenous tribes and unsettled lands, especially along the frontiers. Qi was one of those frontier colonies, and while the Zhou Confederation dominated the Yellow River Valley and the North China Plain, to the south and west were a diverse mix of ethnic peoples populating states that will dominate our story later, such as Wu. The state of Wu, their people, were descended from Southeast Asian mariners, the Yue people. That's the same word as Viet in Vietnam. Their ferocious tattooed warriors were to the Zhou what the Gauls were to the Romans. From the 11th to the 8th centuries BCE, the Zhou kings, ruling from their personal domain located in the Wei River Valley, well, they maintained their primacy. But a major shift in the balance of power came in the early 700s. The 9th century had been awash with internal and external strife. Succession crises raged among the Zhou's eastern vassals, and nomadic invasions threatened the north and west. King You struggled valiantly to restore order, personally leading armies on both fronts. But earthquakes and eclipses seemed signs that Zhou had lost mandate of heaven, a term they'd coined themselves to justify their overthrow of the Shang 3 centuries earlier. Then in 771, a people called the Rong invaded the Zhou homeland. They sacked the capital and killed King You. Fortunately for the dynasty, rulers loyal to the Zhou from the states of Qin and Jin helped the royal family evacuate to the east. There they built a new capital at Chengzhou, near modern Luoyang. A much weakened Eastern Zhou would survive another 500 years, thanks to the loyalty of the dukes, rulers who'd actually spent the last 3 centuries expanding at the expense of their neighbors, both lesser Zhou polities and indigenous peoples. The more ambitious dukes had also brought massive unsettled regions under cultivation. But despite their significant personal power, these Zhou vassals agreed to continue to recognize the Zhou kings as the cultural and religious center of gravity of Huaxia culture, and to defend civilization from what they viewed as barbarians. So the first 3 centuries of what we call the Eastern Zhou are called the Spring and Autumn period, after a contemporary historical chronicle compiled in the state of Lu. This era saw the elimination of hundreds of aristocratic houses that had once ruled those small feudal domains, those city-states, giving rise to ever larger and better organized states dominated increasingly by powerful monarchs. This period also marks China's transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age. Iron ore is vastly more common than the copper and tin needed to make bronze. And once they'd mastered iron smelting, ancient Chinese foundries produced vast quantities of agricultural implements and weapons. The demographic and strategic implications of iron explain how Chinese states expanded far beyond the Yellow River region to rule areas south of the Yangtze River and to move southwest into the fertile Sichuan Basin. Among the most significant innovations was the iron axe. Sharp, durable, and relatively cheap, iron axes ended up felling millions of trees, producing lumber for construction, tools, weapons, siege works, what have you. Not to mention the charcoal to smelt even more iron. Those axes cleared anywhere from hundreds of thousands to millions of acres of new farmland. But that led to the silting up of the Yellow River irrigation systems. That silting required states to mobilize millions of peasants to dredge those waterways. And while the Zhou's vassals may have agreed to cooperate in defending the new order, that didn't mean an end to intense competition between them. These rulers were constantly jockeying to be the most politically and militarily powerful. In this contest, frontier states like Qi had an advantage. For one, they had room to expand, to bring more land under cultivation. Farmland controlled by the duke, not by lesser aristocrats. As a coastal state, Qi was also a major salt producer. Salt back then is like oil today, a resource that everyone needs and a major source of revenue. Qi was also rich in timber and iron, which, like salt, became a state monopoly. And Qi was what we might call pro-business. The 6 secret teachings insist that merchants be protected and encouraged. This included measures such as minting coins and extending the road system, all of which required effective central administration and benefited from the fact that Qi sat astride major trade routes. The Duke of Qi was therefore the first of 5 strongmen in the Spring and Autumn period granted the title Ba, hegemon. The Zhou kings still had soft power, the moral and religious authority that maintained their mandate of heaven. But the hegemon had the economic and military hard power. The architects of Qi's rise and of its hegemony were Duke Huan, who reigned from 685 to 643 BCE, and his chief minister, Guanzhong, who implemented reforms that would be emulated and expanded by Chinese states for centuries to come. In fact, Guanzhong would become an archetype of the able minister, idolized for his benevolent and rational policies. But while Qi had innate advantages, reforms enhanced the reach and power of the central government. Salt and iron monopolies were expanded. Urban and rural populations were organized into administrative units that managed tax collection and mobilized labor for public works projects and for military service. And a clear chain of command linked lower-level administrators up to the central government. Throughout, personnel decisions were based on performance, not pedigree. But it wasn't all business. Like their neighbors in Lu, Qi's dukes promoted the arts, letters, and sciences. They recruited great courses profs from across the Zhou world to travel to Linze to teach and debate. The standardization of Chinese characters, the proliferation of brushes, inks, and writing media, such as the bamboo slips on which the Sun Tzu is preserved, allowed these ancient Chinese scholars to propagate the great ideas of the age. All that high culture notwithstanding, Qi's reputation was built first and foremost on martial prowess. And even when there was a powerful hegemon, warfare was still endemic. The histories of the period chronicle more than 200 wars in the spring and autumn period alone. Wars between Zhou states and indigenous peoples, between the Zhou states themselves, and the inevitable civil wars sparked by frequent succession crises. This led to the attrition of the aristocracy. Many of them died in battle. This was a warrior aristocracy that leads from the front. More died as a result of court intrigue and civil war. That could feature the systematic extermination of entire clans of political rivals. And as the aristocracy began to disappear, so did their big private estates, with land increasingly coming under private cultivation and taxable by the central government. Meanwhile, the competing rulers of these states were increasingly relying on the most senior class of commoners, the shi, a term sometimes translated as knights or scholars. In ancient China, shi were becoming those great courses profs and their students, experts in a variety of areas who sought employment at the courts of would-be hegemons, a class of educated specialists expected to combine intellectual ability and moral integrity. So if we are to believe the biography contained in the 1st century BCE historical records, titled Records of the Grand Historian, Sun Tzu was emblematic of this class of shi. And it's from the shi that many masters emerged. Master is the Zi in Sun Tzu, and as you'll recall, Zi was originally a low-level aristocratic title, sometimes rendered as Viscount. Now it was appropriated by the shi to place their leading lights on par with the aristocracy, to justify their ability to speak directly to the ruler, to literally speak truth to power. And these rulers desperately needed able ministers. So hegemons viewed their ability to attract these worthies as a measure of their power and prestige. But Duquan made it clear that being hegemon wasn't just about power. It was a sacred obligation, an obligation to uphold the status of the Zhou king as the son of heaven, and to act as guardian of Huaxia civilization. And it wasn't just external defense against raiding nomads. The hegemon was just as frequently required to mediate, often with military force, crises within and between other Zhou states. The biggest threat to this shaky balance of power, however, came from the southern kingdoms of Chu, Wu, and Yue. These southern kings claimed various forms of kinship with the Zhou royal family, but the fact that they were calling themselves kings, on par with the still reigning Zhou, indicates that they weren't really entirely bought into this system. After Duquan's death in 643, the next hegemon was the Duke of Jin, a massive state to the north of the Yellow River. Jin became hegemon by leading a coalition of Zhou vassals to stem Chu's invasions of the states of Song and Zheng. Coalitions were essential at this time. Chu, along with its neighbors Wu and Yue, were far larger and significantly less constrained by traditional bonds of loyalty than the Zhou states. The Zhou vassals had to put their squabbling aside to resist these major southern threats. But no sooner had a Zhou coalition blunted a Chu offensive than the Zhou vassals began to fall out amongst themselves, culminating in all-out war between the states of Jin and Qi. Facing war on two fronts, the Duke of Jin began to cultivate Wu as a counterweight to Chu. Wu occupied the lower Yangtze, now China's wealthiest region. Wu's maritime heritage, especially their skills as shipwrights and merchants, gave them mastery of both the sea and of southeast China's lakes and rivers. But while the kings of Wu were encouraged to turn their gaze west to Chu, they were still contending with their perennial foe, Yue, to the south, with whom they shared significant cultural and linguistic similarities. Familiarity can breed contempt. To hedge against these threats on both fronts, King Helu's strategy, ostensibly guided by his prime minister, Wu Zishu, and General Sun Wu, was to deploy one of each of his three armies to periodically harass different Chu regions, confusing Chu's armies before launching a decisive amphibious strike up the Huai River. Knocking Chu out of the picture in 506 BC meant that Wu was at its peak, with Helu recognized as hegemon, Ba. Apparently disgusted, however, by his boss's behavior during the sack of the Chu capital, including the desecration of the tomb and the body of the late Chu king, Sun Wu's professional integrity caused him to resign his command and retire to the countryside. As such, we might blame what happens next on Sun Wu's absence, or it might simply be the result of ancient China's vendetta culture. With Chu humbled, Wu invaded Yue, but Helu was killed in battle. His son Fuchai had his own revenge by invading Yue 3 years later and forcing a humiliating treaty on the Yue king. Fuchai then made play for hegemon. He built a northerly canal by which Wu flotillas could attack both Qi and Jin. Wu Zishu, the prime minister, tried to warn Fuchai that the real threat was still Yue, and that these northern states were strategically peripheral. The prime minister ended up paying for that advice with his own life. As Fuchai moved north, King Gojian of Yue, well, he had a chance to launch his own vendetta. He personally led an assault on Suzhou and killed Fuchai's heir. The Wu king did manage to retake his capital, but Gojian was not in a forgiving mood. He laid a protracted siege on Suzhou and eventually forced Fuchai to commit suicide. The Wu state came to a violent end. In 1965, archaeologists working in Hubei province unearthed a gleaming and still deadly sharp sword belonging to King Gojian of Yue. The king was likely wearing that magnificent sword as he made his way to the Zhou court for investiture as hegemon. But by that time, the office had become essentially meaningless. Gojian was the last Ba. Gone was the idea that a rough balance of power could be maintained under the fiction that Zhou kings still possessed the mandate of heaven. Pure power was the order of the day, and the statecraft reforms begun in Qi and spread gradually over the prior 2 centuries, well, they only accelerated. They accelerated rapidly in the subsequent Warring States period. Now, there's several events that mark the spring and autumn to Warring States period transition. One was Wu's extermination. A second major event, although seemingly minor, was the end of the Jiang family dynasty in Qi. Qi continued to be a major power throughout the Warring States, but the descendants of Jiang Ziya were violently overthrown. That meant that a family that had had close kinship ties with the Zhou kings was replaced by one whose sole asset was power. Finally, that huge state of Jin was partitioned. Jin had been hegemon at the peak of the system. Its partition into aggressive revisionist states called Wei, Zhao, and Han only accelerated interstate competition and the centralization of state power. We can see these trends culminate 2 centuries later in the tomb of the first emperor of China, the last king of Qin, the last of China's warring states. While the first emperor was buried with a complete terracotta circus troupe and all the paraphernalia to party in high style for all eternity, it's the ranks and ranks of mass-produced terracotta warriors armed with high-tech standardized weapons that guard his tomb that are to this day the star attraction. The cruel logic of the warring states was that only those states that bureaucratized and centralized stood a chance of surviving this zero-sum death match. And no state was better at that than Qin, especially once it had embraced the most extreme of the 100 schools of thought, legalism. Although we tend to associate legalism most closely with the 3rd century writer Han Feizi, he essentially only completed the philosophical and political work started by a gentleman named Shang Yang. Shang Yang was senior minister to Duke Xiao of Qin in the mid-4th century BCE. Prior to that, Qin had been a minor player doing most of the Eastern Zhou. The lands they occupied, modern Shanxi and Gansu provinces, had once been the Wei River Valley heartland of the Zhou royal clan. In fact, Qin's ancestors got their start providing the Zhou kings with horses for their war chariots. The first Duke of Qin was a minor noble. He'd helped the Zhou court flee east after their capital was sacked in 771 BCE. In gratitude, the new duke was tasked to defend the Zhou's western flank. The aristocrats of the Spring and Autumn period made no secret of their disdain for the arriviste Qin, little better than barbarians to old-school Huaxia elites. Fortunately for Qin, while the Rong nomads remained a nuisance, they were a manageable nuisance. The Qin built a series of border fortifications and open horse markets that created an effective mix of carrots and sticks to contain the nomad threat. To the east, mountain ranges and strategic passes partially shielded Qin from the endemic wars of the Spring and Autumn period, and especially shielded them from the powerful state of Jin. Jin's partition created an opportunity for Qin eastward expansion. But to expand, Qin had to first set its own house in order. Because while relatively secure and self-sufficient, Qin was far from rich. It wasn't rich in terms of population, productivity, or natural resources. That would all change with experiments in radical statecraft and a commitment to major infrastructure, irrigation, and social engineering projects. Now, scholars debate the accuracy of the translation legalism. The Chinese is Fa Jia, or the school of Fa. That's the same Fa as in Bing Fa, military methods. Calling it the school of law makes sense given Qin's mania for promulgating law codes and their very strict system of rewards and punishments. But the systematic or methodical school might also work, given how Qin systematically and methodically approached state, society, and military organization. Qin standardized legal codes, weights and measures, axle widths, currency, and they introduced a simpler written script. As their kingdom expanded, they used standardization to methodically integrate conquered territories. The China scholar Arthur Whaley suggests realist instead of legalist, given the Qin's cold-blooded foreign policy, and Xiangyang's core assumption that people are essentially profit and pleasure-seeking. The early Confucians had argued that human nature was essentially good, and if people are governed with morality and benevolence, they'd become good likewise. Xiangyang, in contrast, believed that people are only good when they know they'll be rewarded for good behavior and punished for bad behavior. A minor aristocrat from the state of Wei, Xiangyang had studied Guanzhong's reforms in Qi, but wanted to implement them on a grander scale. Society in Qin would be systematically engineered to serve the state, with people primarily working as farmers or as soldiers. But there were notable differences between Xiangyang and Guanzhong. Qi had promoted both commerce and scholarship. Qin, however, suppressed private commerce. They thought of merchants as parasites, siphoning wealth out of the state and out of the people in exchange for needless luxuries. Meanwhile, philosophy and the arts only distracted the elites from their core duties. The Qin banned any school of thought that didn't serve its agenda. An aristocrat himself, Xiangyang declared war on the Qin aristocracy, seizing their estates, eliminating their sinecures. The only way you could become rich and powerful in Qin were by farming or military service. And there was only one aristocrat that mattered, the supreme ruler. Even members of the royal family were subject to the same laws as commoners. That included Duke Xiao's son, whom Xiangyang subjected to a humiliating punishment for a minor infraction. Xiangyang would pay for that with his life when Duke Xiao died. The new ruler, that young man he had punished, King Huiwan, had Xiangyang tried for treason and subjected him to one of the punishments that the prime minister himself had established. Xiangyang was lashed to a series of chariots and torn apart. His family was exterminated to the 9th degree. That meant Xiangyang's grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, all his wives, all of his children, their spouses, and their children were all executed. But even with Xiangyang out of the way, King Hui retained all his reforms. And like the rulers of the last 7 warring states, jettisoned duke for king. By now, the Zhou figureheads were essentially irrelevant. By the time that a 13-year-old named Yingzheng ascended the Qin throne in 247 BCE, Qin had been completely transformed. And by 221, the other warring states were all gone. Qin prevailed because it was mobilized for war via a centralized bureaucracy. As a result, Qin was supremely autocratic. Unlike other warring states, still many of them more feudal confederations than centralized monarchies. Qin was also supremely bureaucratic, meritocratic, and technocratic. Qin bureaucrats, selected and promoted on merit, systematically registered and taxed the growing population and mobilized thousands of people for huge public works projects. Qin technocrats developed advanced farm implements to spur production. They also plotted roads and designed vehicles to get agricultural surplus into state hands. They published farming manuals and experimented with new crops, while state and private firms produced all manner of iron tools, while the state-owned mills processed the grain that was produced. The weapons and vehicles that poured out of state armories and the roads that radiated out from the capital translated Qin's internal innovations into external power projection. One of these royal highways, the Stone Oxen Road, traveled south into the lush Sichuan Basin, where Qin armies would eventually overthrow the Shu and Ba kingdoms. Recent archaeology reveals that the people of Sichuan lived in a wholly different cultural and linguistic world from the warring states. That world was completely destroyed when Qin annexed the region in 316 and mercilessly stripped its vast agricultural and mineral wealth. Qin was also physiocratic. Agriculture was the foundation of state power. Farming families produced two key commodities, food and children. Qin did everything possible to encourage the production of both. Agricultural land was divided into grids. The grids of fields demarcated by roads. Individual family fields were demarcated by footpaths. These standardized plots were assigned based on what a single farming family, a nuclear farming family, could reasonably cultivate. The grid system also facilitated government accounting for crop yields, of tax revenues, and of the population. If a household included an unmarried adult son, well, that family was taxed at higher rates. The grid system also transformed villages from organic communities into administrative units. It replaced kinship with government-imposed 5 and 10 family squads, a structure that mirrored the army. And many of these new landowners weren't natives. Qin aggressively encouraged migration. They offered free land for either military service or labor on infrastructure. State administration mirrored the farmland grid. The kingdom was divided into commanderies, each commandery subdivided into counties, and all those districts were administered by royal appointees, men with proven military records. That also meant that Qin was supremely stratocratic. Yingzheng was a warrior king, and much of the state's immense power was channeled toward the military contest with the other warring states. The military itself was primarily infantry, comprised of hundreds of thousands of peasants equipped with identical arms and armor, and receiving standardized training. And the military enterprise was vertically integrated. The state owned the iron, copper, and tin mines. They ran the forges and made sure that its smiths forged weapons that met Qin's exacting standards. One example are the ancient bronze crossbow triggers unearthed with the terracotta warriors. Those triggers are finely made, easy to operate, and they're interchangeable with triggers manufactured at facilities hundreds of miles away. Qin soldiers were much like those triggers. Thousands of interchangeable parts in a modular military machine. It was these armies that systematically eliminated Qin's rivals. That began with the overthrow of the last Zhou king in 256. That was followed by the conquest and annexation of Han, Zhao, and Wei, and then that vast southern state of Chu. Next was Yan, near modern Beijing. Last, and not surprising, was the conquest of the great state of Qi, Sun Wu's homeland, where the Eastern Zhou's statecraft revolution had begun. It's to this transformation of the war machine and the challenges of managing its complexity that we turn next. I'll see you then.